Today we're going to be talking about spirituality. And spirituality is a bit of an umbrella term that encompasses many different things. And that's kind of what I like about it and kind of the point of it. It contains all these different aspects, but it doesn't, delineate or depict many different traditions, many different practices, many different ideas. But they're all unified by the one singular concept that there is one unifying reality underneath all things. This plays out in different ways, and we'll get to the more scientific, quantum mechanic aspect of it later on. But for me personally, I like the term spirituality, and I like the fact that it's nebulous in a sense, because ultimately, for anyone who's ever had a spiritual experience, it's not something that can be described. It is beyond communication. It is the ineffable. Part of the reason I like this approach as well is that it puts the emphasis on individual experience. The difference between religion and spirituality, although, obviously there's a lot of commonalities, is that in religion, which is very structured, someone else is telling you what the spiritual experience is, and someone else is telling you how to have it and what to do. And this can be useful. There needs to be a container and a vessel for such things, especially within community, because it is a very confusing experience and leads to a lot of behaviors that we modern humans now demarcate as insanity or craziness, which could be argued doesn't actually exist. It's simply the spiritual process cut in half. But there's a lot of nuance and detail to that, and I'm not fully aware, nor is that the point of today's video. Whereas in spirituality, it is the individual, it is you yourself telling you what this experience is and guiding you in what this experience is. And that's where, if you go too far on your own path, you can easily stray and land in insanity, so that's where the vessel. But those are the two distinctions of how we can organize these examples. I would also define spirituality as opposed to strict materialism, because there is a way to have a somewhat spiritual materialism, at least from a philosophical standpoint. Strict materialism is the idea that consciousness, the experience we are all having, is a byproduct, kind of like an accident, kind of just like an offshoot of math, essentially just one of the possibilities that could have happened, and it did, and that physical matter and energy is the plenum of all being, right? The basic level, the foundation that all things arise out of. Where spirituality, this is reversed. It is consciousness that is the basic plenum, the foundation upon which physical reality and matter and energy is the offshoot. And so those are the distinctions of those two concepts. So in the spiritualist paradigm, and again, I'm taking a lot of leniency because I don't know all of the forms and thoughts out there. I can only speak from my direct experience, and that's what I'm speaking about in this video specifically. Those are the main distinctions, and we'll be speaking of the latter. This one's going to be a bit more personal than usual because of the nature of what it is, because I can't talk about spirituality, right? I can only talk about my version of it and my interpretation. And this is a large part of what I want to emphasize on. But in order to understand and explain why I want to say all these things, we'll all have to give the background of my experience with it. So my personal journey was, I grew up in a secular home, essentially. We were raised, I went to Sunday school. We were raised slightly Catholic, but our parents never really enforced it so much. So, I went to Sunday school, and I did First Communion. And, we sat in church on Sundays and, important holidays, but it slowly, as we got older and became teenagers, slowly petered out. We weren't into it, and our parents didn't force it. It was a decision for us to make, and, we chose not to have it. And being a teenager, I ended up having negative experiences because, we have this institution that says that we have to do all these things and behave this way. And it says it in an authoritative way. It doesn't ask us what we think or what we want. It says, do this or you're a bad person. And, that didn't strike well. It was like, okay, fine, but then you yourself don't do this. That's not to say that all Christian and Catholic institutions and organizations behave that way. I'm not making blanket statements. I have no interest in such things. But there were many examples, and on the overall, and historically speaking, that is what I saw. However, I do not want to take away from the people, from Christians and Catholics who are out there doing the good work, and who, being part of a community and a church, does actually bring their life meaning and, helps them. There are many, a lot of charity foundations are Christian and Catholic, and they go out and they do the work. They don't just preach. I want to honor both sides of that argument. But as an angry teenager, I didn't see that latter part so much. And having it forced on me when I didn't want to makes it, ruins it a little bit. So I entered my atheistic phase, but like my angry atheistic phase. And I believed that all religion was manipulation. It was a lie. It was the powerful teaching, the non-powerful, oh, you have to do this because we get to decide what you do, and oh, we don't have to follow those rules because we're special, that type of thing. And then the reaction to that is, well, everything they say is a lie. All of it's a lie. Doesn't matter what religion, doesn't matter what culture, it's all bullshit, it's all, And this, one of the benefits of this was it increased my fascination with science. This came later on in my adolescence, but, I was fascinated, well, all right, that didn't work, let me try the other thing. And I began studying. Oddly enough, I was introduced to Carl Jung at this time. I think I was too young for it because I didn't really get it, but it still some kind of resonated somehow. I planted the seed for the fruit later on. But also when I got to college in my early 20s, I was really big and into quantum mechanics and chaos theory. And I read a book on chaos theory, James Gleick's The Birth of a New Science, Chaos, The Birth of a New Science. And coincidentally at the same time, or should I say synchronistically, I also had my first psychedelic mushroom experiences around this time. So I was in college in Vancouver, and the laws a bit more, or maybe not the laws, but the attitude was a bit more lax at the time, so it was easier to get access to quality substances, quality mushrooms, and we didn't have to worry about it so much. But of course, the nature of the black market, you will never truly know. And I had my first experience. And even with my first psychedelic experience, I knew this is profound. This isn't just getting high or neurons firing. This is something real. This is something profound. This is an experience I'm having. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the phenomenon is, but it is a phenomenon. And this is, the scientist in me saying this. And in this phase of my life, and what I really love about science to this day, is the attitude of hypothesis and testing. I have an idea, let me test it. And then from those results, follow where the evidence goes. It doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what they think, it doesn't matter what a society as a whole collectively thinks, follow the evidence, follow nature. And this I loved about science, is even if the results make me uncomfortable, that's true. Test it again, sure. And if it comes out again, then, follow the evidence. Of course, it runs into issues of objectivity, which quantum mechanics disproved, and then that, leads to the spiritual realm. But anyways, going back. So I had these experiences, and I went, okay, the spiritual experience is real, is candid. It's not a lie, it's not manipulation. There are those who use it for that, but the experience itself isn't inherently that. But I didn't know why or how. And I said, okay, if I accept that this is the case, but then I need to prove it to myself. I need to come up with a rational understanding of how this is possible. And very coincidentally at the time, I was reading Chaos. And this was before I had the experience. So I read this book, and it gave me a overall and very rational understanding of how a universe can be interconnected. Fractal geometry being the key here, the concept of self-similarity, which later on which would be discovered in alchemy as above, so below. The idea that you can have reoccurring patterns across scale. And then I thought to myself, well, if the pattern is reoccurring across scale, then you have something that's everywhere at the same time. So the argument could be that spirituality, or the idea of a primordial being, the primordial consciousness, the primordial reality, is simply this pattern that all matter, that all universe and multiverse and whatever, and all existence itself and non-existence itself emerged out of. And because of this, it is inherently interconnected all at once. I was also very much into astronomy as well, and so the idea, the primordial atom, right? That the Big Bang was one singular particle that popped into existence and went boom, and all of reality came from that primordial atom. So then I spent the next 10 years reading about this, the convergence of science and spirituality, the convergence of quantum mechanic thinkers, and what happened, and what does quantum mechanics imply. And that a lot of scientists and a lot of physicists, the leading minds in their fields, when they got to these interpretations, when they got to these understandings, when they got reality itself saying, oh, sorry buddy, I don't work that way, they had to accept that there was something more. It led them to metaphysics. To this day, a lot of physicists don't, and I remember reading this a lot, but physicists hated quantum mechanics. And they hated quantum mechanics because it flew in the face of everything they knew. It flew in the face of everything they understood. It flew in the face of their primordial understanding of reality, of bits and pieces flying around through space, smashing into each other, and that the world was made of parts. Because when you look at quantum mechanics, and we're going to talk about the double slit experiment, when you shrink down, the idea before this was that if we shrink down enough, we can figure out the pieces. And if we figure out the pieces, the primordial pieces that make up everything, and then, kind of like Laplace's demon, then we can figure and calculate, if we had a strong enough brain or machine, everything that those pieces and parts are going to do, and therefore even the future will be known just as well as the past. Although we don't actually know the past so well now, do we? And we've come to discover. So that was the idea. That, this is an orderly universe that follows rules, and if it looks like randomness and what was known at the time as chaos, then it's just, we haven't seen it yet, which is still somewhat true, but in a different way. Then quantum mechanics showed him and said, and this was nature itself, reality itself, being going, you didn't say the magic word, and being like, I'm so sorry, humans, I know this is gonna freak you out, but I just don't work that way. It's not that, a particle is both a wave and a particle. It depends on how you're looking at it. You humans keep trying to do this objective observer thing, but there's no such thing. You being there affects the reality you're in. This negated a lot of the fundamental understanding of how reality worked. And people who, strict materialistic scientists, that was unacceptable. And because what it did is, then you have all these people trying to figure out why, and trying to figure out new theories, and trying to put it all together, and just became this giant mess that people are still trying to figure out. Until, some scientists were like, well, there's a lot of correlation with these ideas with, a lot of Eastern mystical and spiritual traditions. Not only Eastern spiritual and mystical traditions, but that's what a lot of them, the grass is greener on the other side. Also, it's because it's easier to see the grass on the other side, kind of a thing. Opened themselves up to the idea, well, what if it is possible? What if all these cultures and all these religions and all these spiritual traditions from around the world, throughout time, different cultures, different languages, all talking, having similar concepts and ideas, what if physics was just another hat in the ring? Another language and interpretation of these truths. And what happens when we combine them? At the time I read, and shortly after I encountered, I forget how, but Fritjof Capra's, and forgive me if I said the name wrong, the Tao of Physics. It had a huge impact on me, because that's exactly what it did. Here's, a physicist, straight-laced, by-the-book physicist going on about the similarities of physics and Eastern mystical tradition. And to me, I'm like, well, as a scientist, by attitude, obviously I'm not a trained I'm not a formal scientist, but from the scientific attitude, I have data points, I have evidence suggesting that this is so, suggesting that the pattern follows this way. So as any good scientist, I must follow that idea. What happens when I play out this hypothesis? And when I play out this hypothesis, it just keeps coming back up with more evidence. So, me, as a good scientist, have to follow the evidence. You know, I was still experimenting with psychedelics at that time, and was still having these deep and profound experiences, and was also very fortunate to encounter, at the same time, Stanislav Grof's LSD psychotherapy, and the concept of transpersonal psychology. And I was already interested in psychology for many years at that point, so to have that, to have chaos theory and transpersonal psychology, chaos theory and quantum mechanics and transpersonal psychology be my backbone as I embarked on this journey and experience was very fruitful and supportive for me. It gave me the framework in which to understand this, which later on in life I realized not everybody had access, and a lot of psychonauts and people experiencing psychedelics for the first time don't have access to these ideas and don't know what's happening. I fortunately did not have that journey. I had the information from the get-go. And then through my journey with wanting to understand, and my goal was, let me make this rational. Let me make this manageable for a secular society. That ultimately, that if I understand this and learn this, I could explain it in a way that would make sense for specifically Western cultures, Western modern cultures who do not have access to these things, who do not have experiences and traditions and lineages that go back thousands of years working with these medicines. How do I make it palatable but also understandable for them and approachable for them? Well, let me make it rational. And that was always my goal. And I embarked on a beautiful and wonderful journey that ended up lasting 10 years of just reading as much as possible. This bookshelf, the others too, obviously, but this bookshelf primarily is essentially a bibliography of all, not everything, but of the most prominent things that I've read. I'll put, links later. And the thing that did it for me, that it wasn't someone else telling me what to think, what to believe, that this was an experience I was having internally, that I myself was discovering and telling myself, no, this is you, this is yours. That's what really made the difference and set it apart. And a large part of this, and what I want to emphasize again and again and again as much as possible, because when it comes to people telling you what spirituality is, or essentially what is the nature of this reality we find ourselves, and the nature of what a self is, which is what I hope to do in a helpful way, that ultimately it must come from you. That at the end of the day, you must look inward, and that you and you alone know your experience better than anyone. Now, of course, that can change, and there are dangers to this. Psychosis is the top of the mind, but ultimately, at the end of the day, no one knows your experience better than you. And the only way you will truly understand what this all means and what this world and this reality is if you do the work yourself. It's like learning how to walk. As much as your parents want to support you, as much as they want to help you, they can't move your feet for you. You have to do it yourself, and it's not something you can think about. It's something you have to live and do. And this is the wisdom that all traditions, genuinely spiritual and mystical traditions, that, if they truly have the best interest of the people they're speaking to at heart, that is the, number one advice is you just have to try for yourself. The beautiful aspect of that is that you get to create your own spirituality. You get to create your own religion. Now, me not having a lot of access and not growing up with a lineage and heritage, I would argue that the more current version of Christianity and Catholicism, it was not for me. I did not find it as a spiritual experience. I'm not denying that it can be for others, but it was not my find. So I borrowed from other traditions that experience that somehow seemed to resonate for me more. But even for those who do have a lineage and a heritage to draw upon, emphasis on the primary experience of you going off. A lot of indigenous cultures, the rite of passage is to go off into nature and to come back as a man. It is an active process, but that ultimately it has to be on the individual level. You have to go and meet it. So with that understanding at hand, let's get into the nitty-gritty. The way I've come to think about it, the way, I'm always articulating it and explaining my ideas and concepts through parallels with science, even though I may not know science so well, because that's what I know, that's what I like. I like reading about science. I find it fascinating and beautiful, and such an incredible tool. I would say I'm also very much the other aspect of it, which is I'm very much an artist and into poetry and into the nebulous and the intuitive and the not easily grasped. But honestly, for me, it's the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin, two tools for the same job, right? So I don't make that much of a distinction. They are the yin and yang of experience and of knowledge and awareness, and of acquiring knowledge and awareness. But yes, I would akin the spiritual experience to biology. And what happens, or at least what happened for me, is that they talk about this primordial whole, right? The Great Spirit. The idea that consciousness, the experience we're having in we say minds, but it's not really happening in our minds now, is it? Is it even happening within our bodies? And a lot of cultures and a lot of speakers, especially in the New Age movement, speak about how bodies are simply just the receptors of conscious experience. It doesn't happen in us. It's just tuning into like the way TV tunes into a frequency. It's just all around us, and then this body incorporates a piece of it that identifies as Andre, But it's not, Andre doesn't exist in this body, or more accurately, Andre doesn't only exist within this body. There's just a piece of me. Or in other words, that the spiritual experience is, or more accurately, I'm a piece of something larger, is ultimately the idea. That when we think of when we think of the person, Andre, well, what does that mean? Am I my thoughts? Am I my conscious self? Am I the narrative going on of who am I? What does that imply? What am I going to do after work tomorrow? That type of thing. And for a large part of us, this is not only the first experience we have of reality and of being a self, but it's also what is fed back to us by our society, by our culture, in Western modern cultures, for example. Or not even just Western and modern cultures as a whole. The reasons for that are not relevant to this video yet, but the idea is that this is all I'm aware of at this point. And the word awareness is key here. I'd also like to bring a distinction to the idea of awareness. When we think, or at least as far as I can tell, when most humans think or have an experience, they're not thinking about everything around them. Or more accurately, they're not aware that there's a limit to this experience called thought. That when I'm alone with my thoughts, thinking about what I want to do, what I want to be, oh, that asshole, cut me off, my reaction to other people, I'm not aware of their experience of this situation. I'm only thinking for myself. I'm not even aware that I can have awareness of an experience outside myself. And I want to make this distinction because we have a culture that teaches us that thought is the only thing that's real. And that feeling is a silly, childish thing and a secondary, you disregard it. I, as I've said in many of my videos, believe the opposite. And when you delve into both science and spirituality, you realize that it's the opposite. We are animals. We have always been animals. We will always be animals. Humans have suffered a delusion for the last thousands of years where we tried to convince ourselves that we weren't. And the big three religions have a lot to do with this. Part of the reason I had such an animosity, and just collectively as a culture, there's a lot of trauma and tenderness. For the last 2,000 years, these three traditions have tried to teach us that our animalisticness, or the fact that we're animals, was wrong, and that we need to constantly suppress it and remove ourselves from it, and try to convince ourselves as much as possible that we are not animals. Of course, that could never happen, and the fact that trying to do that will only hurt us because we're denying the reality itself. There's nothing wrong with being an animal. There's nothing shameful about being an animal. Yes, animals are violent and angry and have explosive impulses, but animals are also the source of communion, compassion, and gentleness. All animals know that you're supposed to be gentle with a baby. You don't have to teach them. It's instinctual. As animals, we make our decisions emotionally. We don't think critically, well, what about this, and that? We can and have that ability available to us if we are trained and train ourselves to do so, but we don't start off that way. A large issue I have with all of these arguments and all these assumptions that people around, make, and I'm not talking about the people on TV, although they do it too, but I'm talking about, when dealing with people on a day-to-day level in the layman's world, you could say, is that we make the assumption that we are self-aware, that we understand our reality, and that we understand how humans think. And I'm talking me, on the individual level. Free will is available to humans, but free will is not a given. And free will is the idea to have agency. But in order to have agency, you need to know what reality you're in and how it works. But in order to know what reality you're in and how it works, you need to know how you work. And this is not a given. Humans are one of the very few creatures that aren't born with innate knowledge. It has to be cultivated, it has to be grown. We have to spend time introspecting and thinking about it, And one of these things is the reality that if you are the instrument by which you perceive the world around you, and if you do not know how that instrument works, then you do not perceive the world around you. It's like you're wearing rose-colored glasses your entire life, but you never knew you were wearing them until someone takes them off and you go, what the hell are all these other colors, Fish don't know they're swimming in water. And so to be aware, so that I have a lot of issues with people complaining about the world and complaining about, other people, and sometimes, and it's like, no, you don't understand. You can't make statements about other people in the world around you until you understand yourself. And you don't understand yourself. There's nothing wrong with this. This is how we start. And this is how children start, and how we're supposed to be taught and cultivated in a healthy culture and society, which we do not currently live in. So awareness is not a given. Awareness is something that has to be trained. And not someone else training you, although that is helpful when it's consensual, but you have to train in yourself. You have to cultivate it like a skill set, which a lot of us do not do. The education system in most modern cultures is geared specifically against that. We keep thinking of ourselves as thinking machines. We are not thinking machines. We are feeling animals. Awareness happens here first, and then this kicks in and helps out. The problem with modern society is that we view the experience as a mental experience. It's even in the name mental health, which is a complete misnomer. We're not talking about your ability to think and solve problems, which could arguably be called the mental sphere. We're talking about your ability to feel and process the reality around you, which is a sensation, a feeling sensation. This is all primary organic gross matter, When we talk about mental health, what we're talking about is emotional health. And when we're talking about emotions aren't abstract metaphors that live in a nebulous virtual space. They are physical, they're literal, they are real. Emotional health, as it should be called, is a real experience. It is a physical experience. Part of the problem of growing up with mental health issues like I have is that no one believes you because it's not physically visible, at least at first. They think you're being lazy, they think you're being selfish or spoiled or childish. You just need to suck it up and work harder just like the rest of us. And that is not the case. The pain is real because it's literal, it's physical. So before any of that, we must first accept we are animals and we don't know what that means. And we don't know what that is. In order to have awareness, you have to accept that you don't have awareness. This is how you learn. This is knowledge. Knowledge starts with the acceptance of your ignorance, because the only time you can remedy ignorance is by becoming aware of it. That's what ignorance means. You're not aware you're ignorant, which also speaks to why we shouldn't be punishing people for ignorance, because it's not a choice we're making. Children are born ignorant. They're supposed to be born ignorant. They're supposed to be taught how not to be ignorant. And, So then what we have is awareness. The experience that, I'm having an experience. I don't know what that experience is. I don't know anything right down upper left of what it is, but I know it's here. I know it's real. I have met people in my life who I did not see this experience. I've always been a highly intellectual, highly self-aware, and, constantly psychoanalyzing myself from a very young age, sometimes even to a fault. So this is it's harder for me to imagine. But I have met people who I had an awareness of what they were doing, or a deeper awareness than they did, and I could not understand how this was possible for them. How this was possible for them not to see it or feel it or know it. A lot of the times I'd point it out and they'd go, oh yeah, I didn't know that, and their awareness grew. No, this isn't the right way to say it. But then where do we pick up from? So it's interesting to see so it's when our awareness increases that we then are able to perceive more. If I'm aware that I don't know what's happening, or if I am aware of my lack of awareness, then what is it that I'm not aware of, Because what happens here is that we change. If we think of an eye looking, and you're just looking at something, and then all of a sudden you have the thought, oh, there's something over there. You change your perspective, and you start looking at the other thing. This is very similar with awareness, although, visual is very directional. But it's kind of the same thing. It's like, oh, I'm not feeling okay. Where am I feeling? And I change my perspective, I change my focus, I change my awareness, which, is a similar concept. I'm constantly shooting my perception out there, not just visually, but auditorily and just like mentally. I'm focusing on all that, but then I stop and go, oh, I'm not feeling okay. What is this? Oh, it's pain. Well, where's the pain coming from? Oh, it's coming from here, And then all of a sudden our awareness increases. And slowly and surely, you grow on this concept. It's kind of a trial and error, repeat, rinse, wash, and repeat. As you do this, in a large part, there's a point in this experience where you start realizing, like, oh, this is happening a lot. There are a lot of things I'm not aware of that I keep becoming aware of. Now, again, this is an active participatory experience. If you, the individual, don't do it, or if people don't do it, it's very hard for it to happen naturally, And when you exist in a culture that's purposefully, constantly trying to distract you and trying to cover you, and with blinders and say, no, don't look at it. There's nothing outside of here, It becomes harder to do, especially when you do have this kind of experience and it gets shut away. It's like, oh no, that's not a valid experience. You're mentally unwell. Go over there. Don't talk to anybody about it. You should be ashamed of yourself for misbehaving, not behaving like everybody else. Or, oh, you poor little thing. There's nothing we can do for you. Such a sad story. That type of, phrasing. When you go deeper into the experience of awareness, and again, I want to iterate that awareness is a felt experience. It goes beyond that. The mental is an aspect of it, but ultimately it is a felt experience. And for me, at least, that was much easier to access it is when I was paying attention to what I was feeling. So then it becomes a game of increasing awareness. And then, philosophy comes into it. So you get to the point when you become aware of your unawareness, you enter a new phase of growth, an interesting phase where you start questioning a lot more things. First, and especially after you do this a few times, which is, one, if I'm aware that I'm unaware, or that I was previously unaware, well, then that means that this could happen again. And if this could happen again, that means it is happening again. It means that there's things that I am still unaware of until I become aware of them. And then it makes you, it brings your attention to the idea of what is known as how much or how big is what I don't know. I'm aware that there are things I don't know. The problem is I'm not aware of how big those things are. And this is, the issue. It's because it could be a lot of things or not a lot of things. It could be infinite, which is a horrifying concept. Because especially for a mortal being, who lives and dies, then my initial reaction is what I'm not aware of could kill me. That there are things happening right now that I'm not aware of that could kill me. This is the knee-jerk reaction. And so a large part of the reason of why we try to avoid our ignorance and the awareness of our unawareness is because it's terrifying. But alas, we must go through this. This is also an issue and part of the reason of why a community and container and vessel for the spiritual experience is useful, especially at this point, because, this is where insanity kicks in. If I wasn't aware previously, like I thought I was, before I thought I knew who I was. I thought I had everything figured out. And now I realize that I didn't. And even if I wanted to go back to thinking that I wasn't, that I wanted to go back to being ignorant, I couldn't, because deep down part of me, there's always a part of me that will know this isn't true. Once it is seen, it cannot be unseen, But then there's also, with that reality, means that right now, I don't know, if I didn't know who I was then as a self, then I don't know who I am now as a self. And the issue of who am I, and if I have all this evidence that suggests I don't know who I am, this can be pretty harrowing. And if you don't have, context or signposts telling you how to keep going, you get stuck in a never-ending loop, which is very painful, and thus the more popularly known versions of mental health, this is where this arises out of, people who get stuck in this phase of repeating. But this, in the spiritual dynamic, in the spiritual background and tradition, this is called the dark night of the soul. Or in the hero's journey, as with Joseph Campbell, this is the moment where the all is lost moment, where even after entering the dark world or the second world, even after getting a little familiar through trials and tests and starting to understand the rules of this world, everything is all for naught. Everything we thought we knew is being challenged, that the old world won't help us, the new world also won't help us. What do I do? The point in the story where one is supposed to go inward and find the inner strength, pull the sword from within, and that is a metaphor for this is for the spiritual experience of when you go inward, and this is what people mean by when going inward and directly connecting to spirit. Who am I? Well, the question to that answer is, I am the self. Not this corporeal self, not my higher self or my spiritual self, which, is around me, that no, you keep going up all the way, or at this point it doesn't really matter what direction, it could also be all the way down, and you just come to the self, the only self there ever was or ever will be, which is spirit, which is God. Now, I avoid the word God because that's, has a lot of connotations for certain people, can be very triggering to some. But ultimately, this is what we talk about. This is what humans have been talking about for years, whether it be in spiritual traditions or cultural traditions or even scientific and secular traditions. But more, not as a individual in the sky who can control things. That itself is just a visual metaphor to help us understand and explain what we are talking about. Even that is lacking in its description of what God actually is. Again, it cannot be described. It is beyond communication. It is ineffable. But we're still going to try anyways, because these are signposts for when you are in the dark night of the soul and you're like, oh, what do I do now? And you just see that magic signpost out of nowhere and you're like, it just goes, go that way, And here's another way we can make the distinction between religion and spirituality, where God's an external experience over there. Oh, I have to worship that. I have to go, that is not me. I'm so lowly and poorly, I have to worship that. And in spirituality, it's when you have direct experiences like, oh no, I am that. I am a piece of that, and I am all of that at the same time. This part gets a little confusing, and this is why reading about quantum mechanics and studying quantum mechanics helps here, because it gives you an understanding and an awareness of paradoxes and that flavor of how paradoxes are possible. And there's other realms, ways to do this, obviously in philosophy and spirituality, people doing it, but I like quantum mechanics because it's very real and physical, and at least for me, that helped a lot, to have a physical example of, no, nature is paradoxical, and it doesn't matter that you don't like it or it doesn't make sense, that's, nature is telling you this. So you have to just, dig in and get your hands dirty and go, okay, I guess we're gonna do this, And when you start dealing with paradoxes, you start entering the spiritual world, because you need to understand within this paradigm, within this framework, and we can give it a hierarchy, that our physical world, that from the secular atheistic standpoint, this is the only thing that exists. We can measure it, we can point, telescopes outward and to try and measure even more, but it's still all within this level, right? This one level of physical reality. And when you get into the spiritual world, you realize, oh no, there are other levels to this. And not only are there other levels to this, that this physical level of reality isn't the primary level of reality as we are wont to think, because we are the center of our own experience, and therefore we think, oh, well, this must be the normal. Sure, there's other people doing things and they're a little different, but ultimately, this is the center of the experience. And it isn't. That's terrifying to a human, because it means we'll die. So if we go outside of this physical world of space and time, well, then that means space-time doesn't exist in the spirit world, or at least in the way we understand it. That space-time is another quality that gets programmed by the spirit world. I was also very lucky that in my early years I read The Creative Cosmos by Irving Laszlo, an Italian physicist, who did introduced a beautiful concept to me that he also got from Eastern and spiritual traditions, called the Akashic realm. That in actual fact, what reality is we have a physical and virtual reality that interact and interplay with each other. And the world we know is that interaction between. That the spirit world, essentially, or an aspect of the spirit world, is this virtual reality doesn't exist in a physical sense, but it is encoded with all the information that has existed. And he goes on to explain a very beautifully fascinating cosmology, which, there's a lot of correlations with a lot of other traditions, especially, Hinduism and the Vedic traditions, of a cyclical cosmological model, in that there was more than one Big Bang. This is, very bare bones, the theory that there was more than one Big Bang, and that the cosmic microwave background is actually the imprint of the universe prior. And that what happens is that we have a universe expanding and then contracting back into a point. And when it contracts back into a point, it expands again, a big bounce, but into a new universe that is informed from the matter and the structure and the forms of the previous universe. So essentially you have a universe, constantly expanding in contraction, but ever growing outwards and building upon itself forward. Which I like that idea a lot. It feels very organic, The whole universe itself is just a living organism, bursting out of its shell into new shells, trying to grow and evolve, just like anything that's alive. It wants to grow and evolve. So that makes sense. I'm not saying that's what it is, but that there's a certain intuition there. So then, and what is this physical universe birthing and growing out of is the Akashic realm, these digital plenum. So then, if space and time does not exist in this level, then what happens is we have a non-local universe, which we've seen in quantum mechanics, non-local phenomena. Quantum entanglement is an aspect of this. And if we have non-local phenomenon, well, the idea of a consciousness that pervades all of reality, that is everywhere all at once at the same time, without, violating the principles of speed of light and gravity and whatnot, well, then this is possible, because who says that light exists in, beyond physics? Or that's what metaphysics means. And a lot of spiritual traditions, Christianity being one of them, there is a God that moves around and then says, let there be light. But, it was doing stuff before there was light. So ultimately light itself is also not primordial. Going back to awareness. So then, if this is the model we are working with, and if this is the model that you as an individual self is trying to increase your awareness of, then there gets to a point where you become aware, you start viewing the world, the physical world, from this perspective. The newfound awareness of, oh, I don't know what this is. Let me look, let me listen, let me stop making assumptions and, stop assuming that I know, stop making rules and stop needing to have an answer, and let me just look, let me just listen, let me just feel. And, then you start absorbing the world around you. And when you have this experience, you start realizing that your awareness, yourself, whatever you want to call this experience, doesn't end at the physical limitations of your skin. And even before we talk about spirituality, we know it doesn't end. We know we give off radiation. Our brain, our bodies are electromagnetic organisms. They give off electromagnetic radiation. We can measure the brain waves coming out of a person's mind. We know this. Heat rises off your skin. What is heat? It's an electromagnetic radiation. It's, a spectrum of it, but still. So even the idea that from a strictly materialistic standpoint, ourselves do not end at the physical limitations of our skin. There's this nebulous field of energy around us that is still a part of us, a part of ourselves. When you enter the subway and you feel that the vibes are off, that's what you're feeling. And if emotions are physical experiences and physical reactions in your body of your organs and bones and tissue structures changing shape and changing hormonal and chemical balance and structure, well, then that too is giving off an emotional, energetic reaction, and that energy is transferred and expressed, outwardly. So you're surrounded. So your emotions then become emotions are energy. So then your emotions are then a nebulous field of energy that surrounds you. If your experience of self does not end at your skin, and it does not end at your energy field, well, then when we talk about energy, then we can, we talk about resonance, energy intermingling. What if I stand next to a person, and if I stand, and their emotional energy field, and I'm not even touching them, but their emotional field energy is touching my emotional field energy, whatever, then it's then where do, if we intermingle, then it's like, well, do I end right halfway between us? Do I end closer? Or is it mixed together? And if it is mixed together, what does that mean? Are we now a part of each other? And then it comes to the question, well, where do I end? And again, we have to go remind ourselves that our definition of I is a little nebulous at this point, because we've understood that if there's experiences I can have that I did not have previously, then who's to say that that version of me was me, And if I can continue to have experiences that I do not have currently, and have this experience again of awakening to new experiences in the future, then who's to say that me in the now is me? So the definition and idea of me doesn't really make sense. And even in this present moment, if we don't think of past and future, I can already understand, I can already be aware of, well, I'm having thoughts in my head. I'm having a sensation in my throat, which is tiredness, but I'm also having other sensations. Is my foot less me than my brain? As modern humans, and strictly, we believed this, but that's not true. How can you have a phantom limb? The memory of a foot, and maybe you might not think your foot is as important as your head, but you don't want to lose your foot, would you? If you had a choice, And who's to say, well, what's more important, my head or my intestines? Well, I need both, And then you already start to understand that there's different aspects of you, that the word I is not a monad, it's not a single, indivisible particle, it is a whole made up of smaller parts. And if you keep zooming in, those parts are made of smaller parts, And then it keeps going down, and we'll stick to the cell level just to be, to spare on time. And the idea that your cells, the nucleus is considered the brain of the cell. It makes decisions. It either produces this chemical or produces that chemical or whatever. And yet, so in a sense, it could be said, well, the cell has a kind of an individualism to it. It makes its own decisions apart. It makes it in community with the cells around it, and it makes decisions based on what all the other cells are going around. But it can make decisions for itself. So then is that cell no longer a part of you because it has agency of itself? No, my cells make up me and, ultimately on the overall. So then Me, the individual, becomes an emergent property, emergent experience, that on the individual I don't exist, but when you collect all these cells together and collect all the net, events and exchanges and experiences of these individuals, that net experience is me. But if that is happening, then who's to say I'm the end of the food chain? Who's to say that it stops with me? Who's to say that I myself am not a cell in a larger organism? And that's the metaphor I'm trying to get to. That is the case. That when I stand next to another person, and that, they're having their experience, and I can make decisions about myself, and I have agency, but I still have to make decisions and expectations based on what that person's experiencing and what collectively we're experiencing. And because we all have a knock-on effect in each other and can affect each other, we are all connected simply through cause and effect. And the idea that, oh, well, I'm going to do something that only I benefit from, and I'm going to take from them so that they, I benefit and they don't, well, in the short term, maybe, but in the long term, we've seen no. Because in the long term, that effect comes back around again, simply through cause and effect. You can see the dominoes fall. You push the dominoes like, ha, that made them fall over. That's funny. Oh, wait a minute, it's coming back. Oh, I'm part of the same domino thing. Fuck. So even through that alone, we don't even have to get the spiritual realm of it, but just like from a strict materialistic cause and effect sense, we are all interconnected. What affects me affects the person halfway around the world who I don't even know exists yet. So there's no such thing as me alone, or I, the individual, or me as a lion, or I'm going to do my thing over here. You guys, I don't want to know about the rest of you. And then adding that to the spiritual understanding, we realize oh, the self doesn't end with me. That my community is also the self. That I am my community. And that my community and that community are also, nested within a larger community, a larger whole. And then you can have the idea of circles within circles, or ultimately fractal geometry. And that reality is a fractal. And so what ends up happening is you have just the same way that all these different cells that then form different communities of organs and tissues that then ultimately also work towards a larger whole. Me, the individual, and all the other individuals within my community and the communities around me, and then ultimately form a larger whole. Or, more accurately, an organism, which is the organism of planet Earth. We are the cells within planet Earth. But then it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop with planet Earth. That planet Earth itself is a nested whole within a larger hierarchy, a larger structure, a larger organism. And that's ultimately what I'm getting at, is that when we talk about God, when we talk about spirit, we're talking about a living, breathing, sentient organism that we are all a part of, smaller versions of. And the reason humans can have a spiritual experience, can have an awareness of this larger organism, this thing that is beyond understanding, is because that larger organism's code, its DNA, or, its metaphorical DNA in this sense, is, literally, is structured within us, holographically. So what a hologram is you shoot two lasers. One laser hits an object, and that laser encodes all the information, at least structurally, of that object, what it looks like, and then hits a piece of film, and then the second laser hits a mirror, bounces off the mirror, hits the other piece of film, and then that film is encoded with the visual information of the object that it was bounced off of. And then what ends happening is that this film is encoded with the information. That if you shot a laser through this, film, it would project the apple. And not only would it project the apple, but it would project the apple in a 3D model. It wouldn't be the apple, but it would look like the apple. And you would look at it and you'd look around, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless you put your finger through it, right? So this is holographic encoding, how, information is stored. Now what happens is, if you cut that film in half, it does not cut the image in half, because the information is stored non-locally. Every aspect of the piece of film contains every piece of the information. So if you cut it in half, you just get an apple with less resolution. And if you cut it in quarters and you cut it small, you're still going to get the full image, just but with less resolution. That is what we are. The full picture of the cosmos, but with a smaller resolution. When we gather with other humans, and we gather in community, and we gather collectively, that resolution expands, and we get a clearer picture of the cosmos as a whole, or of God as a whole. So what we are the cells and the smaller organisms within the body of the largest organism. With that understanding, now, for a lot of people, that's a hard one to swallow, so you got to work with that on your own. But once you get to that point where you're just like, oh yeah, okay, so I'm God, or like a piece of God, but holographically, but I'm also God itself. That's a little awkward, but like that one you got to figure out on your own. So once you get to the understanding that, like, okay, we are the body parts of a larger organism, and that this is the reality that's happening, that we are birthed out of a infinitely sentient, infinitely intelligent and creative, and most important of all, infinitely lovable and loving organism. So then it comes down to the argument, well, why? And this question doesn't really make sense because there will never be an answer, and even if there is an answer, we can't understand it. How can we understand the mind of God? Well, we technically can because of the whole holographic thing I mentioned previously, but we also can't because it's beyond language and communication, and ultimately, I'm not God right now, I'm Andre Pontes, right? That's, I chose to be born in this incarnation version of me. Why did, if you had this supremely powerful being that is all-knowing, already knows everything. There's no future and past to this organism because it is both the future and the past and anything that could ever happen or has happened or will happen. And if I already am everything, why would I choose to forget that, right? Because the universe was born out of the universe forgetting what it is. The universe, or the physical universe we live in, was born out of God going, you know what would be fun right now? If I just forgot I was God. This, from here on at this point, is completely my own personal take on it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or anything, because how the hell could I know? But I like to think that the universe got lonely. Because if I am everything, like, put yourself in the perspective of this primordial supreme being. If I am everything, then no matter where I go or what I do, I'm also there. It's like, no, that's just me. I already know everything. And so that would be really boring and lonely. So what would I do? Well, I could forget it was me. And I could make myself forget, and in doing so, create all these different versions of myself, the multiplicity of life, and have different versions of me, running around not knowing that they're different versions of me. This kind of is a weird thing to understand, but when you think of video games, it immediately makes sense. For anybody who's a gamer, you understand, like, oh, I enjoy this game very much. And it's like, well, why, if you already played it, why would you play it again? It was like, well, because it was an enjoyable experience. Except this time, I'm going to be a different character, So ultimately, this is, in a sense, it's very crude, obviously, but in a sense, this is God's video game. But then why do that? Well, one, because it's beautiful, and two, because we learn from experiencing and having different experiences. Because as infinitely beautiful and infinitely perfect God is, it cannot be imperfect. And that is what God wants, to be imperfect. Because when you are imperfect, you grow, you learn, you experience things you wouldn't have otherwise experienced. And that is ultimately the purpose of this, growth. Because as any living thing, all it wants to do is live and grow and evolve and know itself. We are the mirror of God. We are the universe looking at itself and going, oh, wow, isn't this amazing? So from me to you, whoever you may be, even though technically I already know you, thank you for being here. And isn't this amazing?